We're beginning the reading, Introduction to Geopolitics. Heavy stress on the word introduction. This really is a very shallow introduction to what is otherwise a deep and interesting topic. The term geopolitics showed up rather late in the lexicon. I think it was 1890 to 1900, in between that period of time where it first showed up. And there was this idea that if we're trying to explain why some countries cooperate and why some countries compete, perhaps where they're located in the world matters. Perhaps geography can help us explain this. Geography covering all sorts of things like resource endowment, their access to waterways. Take a country like Switzerland, which is completely landlocked. It has a higher incentive to cooperate with its bordering countries because everything that is supplied to Switzerland must travel through another country first. Take a country like the UK or Britain, historically always surrounded by water. Any attack on Britain would have come by the sea. This was way before planes. So it would be no surprise that one of the national interests of Britain at the time was a very strong navy, and it had the world's, or it was known as the world's greatest naval force for centuries. Also helps explain why countries like Canada and Uruguay have never gone to war. We don't have a border. We don't share a border. We have no need to compete on anything, and our national interests don't cross because geographically we're so far apart from each other, we don't get in each other's way. Whereas Canada and the US have a very strong motivation to cooperate because we have the longest land border, I think, globally. So let's get into it here with that little bit of background. Geopolitics, the study of how geography affects political and international relations, when countries get along and on what dimensions they compete. Geopolitical risk is the risk associated with all of that geographical positioning. Risk associated with tensions or actions between actors, and actors can be individuals, organizations, companies, and national governments. We'll see later that we classify them into state and non-state actors. But tensions or actions between actors that affect the normal and peaceful course of international relations. Geopolitical risk can impact economic growth, interest rates, access to key resources. This is a big one. Typically when risk or geopolitical risk flares up somewhere, whatever the natural resource in that area is that the world exports from there usually sees a huge jump in price. So just to look ahead to the futures market, if we think about oil is typically priced like this. So this would be a spot rate here, and these are the futures prices each month out. It's typically in contango. When geopolitical risk rises, the spot rate shoots up and gets very, very high, and the curve goes into what is called backwardation at that point. So access to key resources, supply channels, and access to markets, especially when sanctions are then overlaid on top of any flare-up of conflict or any increase in risk. Those markets end up being shut off very quickly. It also affects the currency of the target country. And if the currency of that target country depreciates very, very rapidly, you have massive inflation within that particular country. So obviously that's going to affect risk premiums, how much you need to get paid for holding on to certain securities. It's going to affect your asset allocation decisions. If geopolitical risk rises over an entire continent, let's take the Russia-Ukraine crisis of early 2022, that really affected your positioning in European assets altogether. And it drove a demand for safe haven assets. So U.S. Treasuries and the U.S. dollar really gained in value on that. Also affects your decision of what geographic exposure that you want. Okay, let's define what a state actor is. Once we know what a state actor is, everyone else is a non-state actor. These are national governments, political organizations, and country leaders. And here is the key here. They exert authority over a country's national security and resources. And of course, non-state actors are individuals, companies, organizations that do not have that kind of authority. So non-governmental organizations, multinational companies, charities, influential individuals. You can think of people like Bill Gates, George Clooney, Al Gore. Features of political cooperation. Cooperative countries work together towards some shared goal or purpose. Obviously, if it's cooperation, there's your key word, right? You're going to have some kind of shared goal or purpose, whether it be military, you can think of NATO here, whether it be economic, you can think of economic unions, free trade zones, or cultural. I tried to find a good example of one here, and the best one that I can find is access to media. So let's take two countries that are side by side. They each have their respective media channels. Cooperative countries will have access to all these media channels in both countries, whereas non-cooperative countries will block a whole bunch of media from entering their country. So we can think of some countries in the world that will block access for their citizens to things like YouTube, any other country's media channels, Facebook, any of these social media platforms as well. I say that's cultural simply because if you're broadcasting in from a neighboring country, you're also importing through the airwaves their culture, their language, their comedy, their dramas, and all of that is a reflection of the culture. On a continuum from non-cooperation to cooperation, this is an exhibit from the reading. I think it does a good job. Rule standardization, harmonization of tariffs, free movement across borders. This is for individuals, what you typically find in an economic union. Permitted movement of goods, services, and capital. This is what you'd find in a free trade zone. Reciprocation. That if you're acting in a certain way, we'll act in that certain way as well. Technology exchange. A big one for reciprocation is for industry is foreign direct investment. Is that you're going to grant me access to your market for our country to sell this particular product in your market, and we'll grant you access to our market. You say that we can set up plants in your country to build exactly what we want to sell in your country. We will let you set up plants and build in our country to do the same thing. Versus non-cooperation, inconsistent rules or rules for one country and a different set of rules for another country, and maybe no access for a third country and really harsh rules for a fourth country, etc. Arbitrary rule. Meaning that there is no consistent theme in some national interest, but it tends to be more the whims of an individual who's running the country. More autocratic. Restricted movement across borders. You'll find that in very highly socialist and communist countries. Restricted trade and capital controls. Retaliation as opposed to reciprocation. And a lack of technology exchange. Let's talk about why countries want to cooperate. Other than just, getting along to go along, why? Number one, national security or military interest. Here, we only need think of NATO. Alone, we are vulnerable and weak, but together, we're strong and invincible. An attack on one is an attack on all. So it acts as a deterrence for those countries who want to be non-cooperative to say, oh, well, hang on there. You don't come alone, you come with a whole bunch of friends. Economic interest. Access to key resources, and the ability of a country's domestic firms to operate on a global scale. Here, membership into the WTO, World Trade Organization, is a big one. For access to key resources, let's talk about a country's resource endowment, because this does set up a lot of power imbalances around the world based on who has critical resources versus who needs those particular resources. So we can think of a country that has a whole bunch of avocados. Well, okay, other countries can go without it if they don't want to be cooperative. Big deal. But you do need the basis of food, wheat, corn, soybean, and you need the basis of energy, whether it be natural gas or oil. So those are the king commodities that take a country that has no domestic energy production. It has to rely very heavily on other countries, so it must be cooperative in that sense. Unequal distribution across countries creates the need, even the desire, for cooperation. and may also create power imbalances inter and intra-country. So inter-country, between countries, you can think of one country that over a cooperative period has set up a lot of energy infrastructure to move energy resources from one country into another country that doesn't have it. And that smaller country, or the country without the energy resources, relies very heavily on the other country for that supply. Well, if there's a breakdown in that cooperation, there is a power imbalance. You can, the energy supplier can get the energy buying country to behave more in alignment with what their interests are than they might otherwise like to. Intra-country, this is common in emerging markets and countries, smaller emerging countries, which are natural resource rich, where a few people will be the beneficiaries of the export and sale of those natural resources, which, since they are natural, they belong to the country. The proceeds should flow back into society and benefit everybody in the society at large. But in less developed countries, especially with corruption, that doesn't always happen. So you have a lot of instability within the country. So some countries, while they may be resource rich, become very uninvestable only because it's coup after coup, because it's either one group of thieves or another group of thieves that want to control that resource. For the second point, domestic firms operating on a global scale, here you're going to need some kind of system that standardizes certain things. So a simple example is, think about your grocery store and you walk into the aisle that has all the beverages. You'll notice that all the boxes and all the bottles are the same size regardless of which manufacturer made them. And it makes it easier for me to buy your product and put it on my shelf. But if I'm importing from a whole bunch of different countries and there's a whole bunch of ranges in sizes and shapes, well, that's going to be very awkward on the shelf. So standardization does have its place. A process of creating protocols for the production, sale, transport, or use of products and services, what would be referred to as the rules of engagement of economic cooperation. In terms of regulation, regulatory cooperation, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, take one country that looks at its banking system and says, okay, we need to regulate you because you are systemically important to the foundation of our economy. But if you're partnering or doing business, let's say in a free trade zone with another country who has very lax banking rules, their problem could create some contagion in your market. So it's harder to cooperate with these companies if some of their systemic failure might contaminate your market. Well, if everybody's on board, right? Process standardization, the big one is SWIFT. This is an interbank communication system, a system for worldwide international financial transactions. So if I'm moving money from my bank in my country to another bank in another country, this is a way that those two banks can communicate very quickly and that money can move very fast. Operational synchronization, here containerization. And what I said about the drinks on the shelves, this is a bigger one here. Is imagine that shipping containers were all different sizes and it really depended on which country you were shipping from. Well, maybe they don't stack very well. Maybe they don't transport from the ship to a truck very well. Whereas if you standardize containers so that they all have the same dimensions, the same shape, the same size, they all hold the same volume, they can all move from a ship to a rail car to a cross-country truck, Class 8 vehicle, then that makes it a lot easier. You don't have to worry about the country of origin of the container and always have to, try to get those containers back to wherever they came from. Next, we have soft power, which is a means of influence without force or coercion. And the reading gives an example of student exchange programs between countries. Another good example would be the use of student visas. So let's take Canada as a good example. Most higher education institutions have recruiting firms in other countries that actively recruit students. The benefit of foreign students is twofold. Number one, when they come to the country, they don't get subsidized education. They pay the full price of whatever it costs. Every Canadian student at a Canadian institution is financed in part by the Ministry of Education for that particular province. They're heavily government funded. But a foreign student pays absolutely everything. Secondly, they consume within the country without employment. So they don't need a job in order to consume. They, in most cases, cannot work. However, they pay for accommodations, they pay for food, and of course entertainment while they're in the city, and they're there for anywhere from 3 years, 2 years to 4 years, depending on their progression. After they're done, most return to their home country. However, they can be hired at that point. And if they are hired by a domestic company, Canada is retaining what we would then refer to as the best and the brightest of the group. And why would we not want to do that, right? So if this is a popular program, if it enforces and supports immigration patterns, then the issuance of student visas become a form of soft power. Cultural considerations in terms of cultural similarities or immigration patterns. We can think of cultural similarities in terms of sharing the same type of political system. So Canada and the U.S. Are so close culturally that if you put a Canadian and an American in a room together and you look at the way they're dressed and you look at what type of shows they watch, music they listen to, it would be hard to tell which one's the American, which one's the Canadian. Immigration patterns, again, this between countries. Lots of different countries have different types of populations within them that are from a particular area. So again, referring to early 2022 with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, in many countries that had large Ukrainian population, there were demonstrations for the government to say, listen, you got to help support our country or our former home country a little bit more. The role of institutions. When we hear the word institution, we usually think of something that has some formal structure. But it can be an established organization that has a formal structure or a practice in a society or culture. So it could be a custom or a behavioral pattern that we refer to as an institution. So maybe you've heard the expression, the institution of marriage. Well, it's not anything that has a building or a formal structure. It is a well-established custom that's referred to as the institution of marriage. You gotta get married. You gotta settle down, buy a home, have kids, that whole thing, right? Strong institutions contribute to more stable internal and external political force, and there is sociological evidence that suggests that countries that have a strong rule of law and strong courts tend to have a lower level of crime and corruption. So institutions that contribute to more stable internal and external political force, things like the rule of law, property rights, human rights. And if you have two countries that both have very strong institutions, it provides more opportunity to develop cooperative relationships that are more durable. But if you have one country, let's say, that has a strong rule of law and strong human rights, and the other country doesn't, difficult to cooperate between the two. And when there is cooperation, it is not going to be as durable. So let's add another element to this notion of cooperation, that being national interests, or a hierarchy of interests, which all countries have. They have a list of things that are important to them. And depending on what they are, they may decide that, well, we can cooperate on these things. However, if there's an interest that lies above what they're cooperating on that feels threatened, then cooperation isn't as important. National interests, these are a company's goals or ambitions, and they may conflict with or support cooperation. And for this, we can think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. where at the very bottom you've got your basic needs of survival, food, water. So a country that doesn't have access to that is willing to cooperate pretty much with any other country to have that satisfied. As their needs become satisfied, safety needs, etc., other things start to become more important. Things that are more aspirational become more important. So that while they're willing to cooperate at these lower levels, if their national interests lie at a higher level and something conflicts with cooperation, this will become more dominant. So I've got a couple of examples here. U.S. versus China. U.S. is big on promoting democracy and human rights around the world, which they think that China is not on board with that. However, they do still want access to cheap labor. So what is higher in their national interests? Is it the promotion of democracy and human rights or the access to cheap labor? Being that they continue to do a significant amount of trade with China, we can see that, well, what is higher on your national interest there, right? I hear you saying this stuff, but I see you doing this stuff. The West versus Russia. The West wants to spread democracy and extend NATO, and we see that this is a problem for Russia. The opposing side of that is the West still needs Russian energy supplies. So how far do you go with this? How important is this to the West versus this? Well, we're seeing this experiment play out in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's look at the power of the decision maker, because this can also affect the level of cooperation versus non-cooperation. So countries can be ruled or governed by a political party system or by an individual, and even by an individual that still claims there's a political party system in, but still wins 96% of the vote no matter what. So here we're talking about a Congress or a parliament. Here we would refer to the autocrat or the director. So when we talk about Russia, we're not talking about the Duma, we're talking about Putin. It's what he wants. Whereas when we talk about countries like Canada or the US, it is the political party that happens to be in power and what that ideology is and what their agenda is. It's not necessarily one individual. Although you could make an argument these days with the types of leaders we have that the Liberal Party in Canada is really what Justin wants, and that's it. And in 2016 to 2020, the Republican Party was really what Trump wanted. So you did have the elevation of the individual over the party on both of those, but that's a separate conversation. When you have a political party system with elections, you end up with short political cycles. So getting things done that require a long-term focus become very difficult to do. So having countries cooperate on things like international institutions, World Health Organization, NATO, COP21, climate change agendas, becomes very difficult to do because the political power can shift in very short periods of time, and the party that has control may say, no, that is not in our national interest anymore. So you have changing priorities. When you have a more autocratic leader or a dictator, we're not really looking at the ideology of the party anymore. You have to consider the psychology of the individual and what it is they're trying to get done for themselves or for their legacy or what's inside their head. So you have a certain level of non-predictability. So when we think of non-cooperation and cooperation, you do have a spectrum, degrees of cooperation and non-cooperation. So you could have two states or two nations that are generally non-cooperative, but will be cooperative on certain other things. So for example, there is when you consider the war between Russia and Ukraine, actually, let's be clear, it's between Putin and Ukraine. When you consider that war, that is a non-cooperative stance. However, natural gas still flows through the pipelines through Ukraine, and Ukraine gets paid for that. So there is a level of cooperation there, although it is generally non-cooperative. So it is rare that you have a country that is simply just non-cooperative on all elements altogether. North Korea would be an example with the U.S. that is absolutely non-cooperative on everything whatsoever. China and the US are non-cooperative on some things, but cooperative on many other things as well. What's a good example of countries that are Canada and the US are extremely cooperative, but they are non-cooperative when it comes to issues of trade. When there is a violation of a part of a trade, Canada has no problem taking the U.S. to the World Trade Organization and lodging a formal complaint, which is a pretty combative stance to take, but we generally are cooperative across the board. For those of you wondering when the word would show up, here it is, globalization, which was the natural trend over the last 20 to 30 years across countries, that economies and countries became more globalized. And only recently has there been a growing amount of pushback against globalization. It is the process of interaction and integration among people, companies, and governments worldwide, mainly economic and financial, but it does have cultural spillovers, mostly through pop culture. Headwinds against globalization that are appearing. Financial contagion. We are seeing that the tighter and more integrated countries around the world become, that a financial or a systemic risk in one part of the world has a greater propensity to spill over into other economies and other countries. Nationalism. And nationalism has always been with us in some form or another in every country, regardless if you are on the right or on the left. There is right-wing nationalism, there is left-wing nationalism. And this is really just putting domestic interests first. So let's look at the U.S. Under the Republican regime from 2016 to 2020. The message from the administration was America first, America first. Which was a nationalistic statement to make, America first. Look at the Democratic administration that replaced the Republican administration in 2020 to 2024 with all of the spending programs that they want to do, the Build Back Better. Their statement in passing some of this, or seeking to pass some of this, is that everything will be sourced in America. So it is their form of America first. American steel used to build American bridges with American labor and American engineering, to the exclusion of other countries that see America as a customer of their steel. Is like, no, you can't be part of this project. America first. So that is economic nationalism from the Democratic side, and previous to that we saw Republican nationalism. So nationalism is not necessarily a dirty word. It has gotten a bad reputation because of actors in the past that tended to be nationalistic and bad at the same time, but nationalism is not necessarily associated with bad people. There are oftentimes good intentions associated with nationalism, which is taking care of your own house first. So before we look at the word nationalism and say, ooh, that's an ugly word, we want to avoid that, let's understand that it comes from all sides, all points on the political spectrum. And it really is just saying, look, if you're going to spend taxpayer dollars, at least this is what the Democratic administration in Washington right now is saying, if you're going to spend taxpayer dollars, let it benefit Americans. And the counter argument to that is, yeah, but what if it just costs a hell of a lot more to get that done, and you could save the taxpayer a whole bunch of money by using imported steel? What about that, right? But anyways, there's that word. Supply channel risk. The pandemic that began in March of 2020 and was, I don't know that there'll ever be an end date to it other than just saying, let's call it endemic instead of pandemic. Disrupted supply channels, and we saw that while you could turn off supply channels very quickly, turning them back on is a very different thing. So there's a lot of reshoring, and reshoring means, look, we had most of our stuff coming from this other country, but because supply channels are so fragile, we should reshore some of the essential components so that we don't have to suffer any supply bottlenecks or supply constraints. Some features of globalization: economic and financial cooperation, mainly by non-state actors, trade in goods and services, capital flows, currency exchange, freely floating currencies, cultural and information exchange. And nationalism is the opposite. Domestic economic and financial activity dominant to the exclusion of the interests of other nations. So this can lead to complaints lodged if you are a member of the World Trade Organization and you institute some part of your government spending to be very nationalistic. It could lead to a complaint lodged with the World Trade Organization that you are limiting access to your market for certain products or certain goods that you agreed by membership into the World Trade Organization that you would allow. Globalization and cooperation tend to be correlated. Some motivations for globalization, we note 3 of them here: increasing profits, access to resources and markets, and intrinsic gain. So for increasing profits, access to new markets to sell your product, increased sales may involve foreign direct investment. So we have country here with an organization that wants to sell its product into another country, may actually require it to actually set up a subsidiary in that country that then produces the product and sells it in that particular country. Lower costs, access to cheaper labor, setting up in lower tax operating environments, and gaining supply chain efficiencies, whether it be through lower production costs combined with lower transportation costs. Access to resources and markets. And we talked about markets up here, but that's markets for your final good. Markets, these are factor markets for the biggest factor market is labor for talent and resources, raw materials. And intrinsic gain. This is difficult to measure. Information exchange, primarily process know-how, and knowledge spillovers. Economists love this word, knowledge spillovers. I'm not a big fan of it because I don't know, without a mechanism of how does knowledge spill over. So I set up my factory beside your factory, and the knowledge of how you produce things will spill over onto my factory. I don't really know how that works. I don't think that mechanism makes a lot of sense. I think the term used by John Hicks in the 1930s, induced innovation, makes a lot more sense instead of using knowledge spillovers. That if my domestic market is now open to foreign competitors, well, I'm going to have to compete not just with my domestic competitors, but with foreign competitors that may be better than me or have a better product or lower costs, which forces me to innovate, which forces me to compete on that basis. So rather than calling it a knowledge spillover, that look, you had these firms coming into your market that were producing at a lower cost, and several years later, ta-da, you're now producing at a lower cost. There must have been some knowledge spillover. Well, no, I don't think that it's knowledge spillover. I think it was, look, I either competed or I went out of business. I either found a way to do it or not. It was this innovation that I undertook was induced by globalization. I had no choice. Costs of globalization and threats of rollback. We like to hear the term, a rising tide lifts all boats. No, it doesn't. A rising tide will lift a lot of boats, but many will sink. And those are called unacceptable outcomes for certain people. The idea behind globalization is that it has the greatest benefit for the greatest number, but there are going to be people who do lose, disproportionately lose, unacceptably. So unequal accrual of economic and financial gains. Trade will always have winners and losers. And typically when governments get involved in trade, they try to minimize the losers by offering subsidies to those particular industries or retraining, or maybe they carve out a protection for that particular industry to try to avoid the losers. But there will be losers. We can think of textiles. In the 1960s, 1970s, the U.S. northern states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, huge textile industry, upper state New York, huge textile industry. But with access to South America, all those and Vietnam, all those jobs are gone. Completely gone. And the U.S. government spent a lot of money trying to prop up the textile industry while paying no attention to California and the rise of Silicon Valley, and backing a losing industry and not a winning industry. So even though there will be winners and losers, some governments will still try to support the losers, thereby losing even more because that loss may be inevitable. Lower environmental, social, and governance standards. When you have a company in country A and it sets up a subsidiary in country B, it will tend to operate to the local standards. So if local standards are lower, thereby making its costs of production cheaper, it may shift much of its production to country B, which has the lower standards, because being environmental, being socially aware, and higher levels of governance, all of these things have a cost. Or I shouldn't say all of these things have a cost. Most of them have a cost. Some of these activities actually may have front-end costs that have much lower running costs going forward, especially on the environmental side. But again, we can think of regulatory arbitrage, where companies will say, listen, labor standards are so strong in this country that when we hire someone, we can rarely ever fire them. However, in this country over here, labor standards are very, very lax. So let's set up most of our labor-intensive processes in this other country. Political consequences. Loser countries. And when I say loser countries, I don't mean, you slap a big L on your forehead and go, loser. I mean, in the terms of winners and losers, some countries will be at a loss when it comes to globalization, that most of their industries cannot compete on a global basis. They will experience net job losses, a level of out-migration and capital outflows. So they're less motivated to engage in globalization. Interdependence. This comes from an over-reliance on the resources or a key resource from another, potentially, and I say potentially, non-competitive or non-cooperative country. Because it could be a cooperative country, but may be uncooperative when it comes to certain, certain things or on certain dimensions. And if you rely on that one country for a key input, well, then that could cause conflict. We'll leave it at that. So over the last 20 to 30 years, globalization has really been the trend among countries and multinational companies. But in the more recent period, there have been threats of rollback, for better choice of words, meaning that some countries and some companies are realizing that there are limitations to globalization, and that the more you globalize, the more it actually exposes weaknesses or vulnerabilities. So we can think of the pandemic that occurred starting in early 2020 and has, into 2022 and onwards, is still with us, but it has highlighted a whole bunch of supply chain issues where we shut down the global supply system and then tried to restart it and realized that it doesn't restart as easily as you shut it down, and causes all sorts of distortions and displacements. And we can use the auto industry as a good example in sourcing supply. They have global supply. So any disruption in transportation, in production, in any of the necessary materials used for production can cause a whole bunch of ripple effects downstream, especially when you combine that or layer that on with a just-in-time inventory system. You have no buffer inventories in the system when there is a supply disruption. So you start thinking about, well, what can we do to avoid that? Reshoring essential production. So let's say that this is the U.S. What we're seeing is companies are saying, we need to set up our own semiconductor plants within the U.S. We've relied on other countries for far too long, and we're seeing that this is going to be an essential input to many products. let's bring that back. Let's bring that back home. Country sourcing diversification. So instead of just going to one or two countries for your semiconductors, the thought is, well, why don't we find everywhere in the world where they're made and geographically diversify so that if there's a breakdown in any one channel, we still have other alternatives. Owning foreign production. Well, you could build that semiconductor facility in the U.S. So you could say, well, hang on a second. We have to replicate everything, including the supply channel necessary for the production of that semiconductor. But there's already a supply channel in this country, so why not just set up another facility in this country and own this production, and we'll have captive production that we can then ship back to our own country. Okay. With that behind us, let's move on to a discussion of different archetypes here. We've looked at globalization, and we've introduced the term nationalization as being the opposite of globalization. Cooperation versus non-cooperation, and we can classify certain types of countries. Hegemony, that word is pronounced hegemony. Multilateralism, autarky, and bilateralism. And we'll start in the bottom corner here, non-cooperative and nationalist with autarkic regimes rely on self-sufficiency, limited trade with the rest of the world, and if you've ever seen the acronym ROW, that means rest of the world. It can result from ideology, or it can result just from isolation. And trade, if there is trade, may be limited to key national security concerns, food, water, energy. From there, we'll move up to hegemony. These tend to be regional or global leaders with enough power and influence in the world. They have political, economic, or military domination. More on the non-cooperative side, but are more globalized. From there, we can go over to multilateralism. Actually, let's do that one last. Let's move to bilateralism. This is more on the nationalist scale, but leading towards cooperation. And bilateralism, I've drawn this out here. This is the country that we're looking at here, let's say country A. And it may have bilateral trade agreements with a whole bunch of other countries, but each agreement is just with between two countries, is a one-off. So it has agreements with B, it has agreements with C, with D, with E, but in no way does it have a combined agreement with all of them. Each one has its own rules and policies. Multilateralism looks like this, where you have country A, B, C, D, E, and they all agree to the same terms of trade. And sitting in between multilateralism and bilateralism is something called regionalism, where within a particular region you have multilateral agreements, but countries that are outside of that region may have bilateral agreements with the regional bloc. If we look at the bottom of the screen, we're going to move on to a new LOS, describe tools of geopolitics and their impact on regions and economies. And again, as you're going through this, if you're saying, but we hardly even talked about the archetypes, well, there isn't much in the reading about each one. There might be, there's 4 paragraphs, and each paragraph is 5 or 6 sentences. So as I said at the very beginning, this is an introduction, heavy on the word introduction. In fact, I would call this reading an introduction to geopolitics. It doesn't really provide you with many tools that you could then use to begin to assess. You probably know more about geopolitics just by watching the news and the business news than this reading has introduced to you. So let's look at 3 tools of geopolitics: national security tools, economic tools, and financial tools. We have 3 broad categories. Economic tools and financial tools pretty much go together. Hard to pull those apart. National security tools, we can look on the screen here. We have NATO over here, armed conflict, terrorism, espionage there. Used to influence or coerce a state actor through direct or indirect impact on the country's resources, people, or borders. May be actively used or just threatened. Either do what we say or we'll invade you. That typically Doesn't work very often. The threat of economic sanctions, either stop doing this thing that you're doing that nobody likes, or we will impose very crippling economic sanctions on your country. Economic and financial tools. We have